Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to wherever you are in the world, and thank you for joining us for this latest edition of our podcast, Digital Clinical Trials. Today I'm really honoured to be joined by two ladies of our industry, two leaders of our industry. First of all, Helen Shaw, who is the co-founder of VCTC, one of the upcoming clinics in the UK, and also Marie-Claire Flavin, who is going to be representing Veeva from a site success and site vault side. Maybe Helen, I can start with you because you have a very interesting LinkedIn title. There's both a very traditional element and then an interesting one. I'll ask you to perhaps explain both. First of all, as a clinical trial site manager, which seems quite a standard industry one, but I noted the extension, which was and short track speed skater, current Masters World Champion. So perhaps we'll start with that piece and then come back to the industry piece.
Okay, so short track speed skating I took up in my late 20s, and so as an adult most people take it up when they're young. It's quite a niche sport in the UK. It's common in Holland and Korea and places like that, but not in the UK. Found I was quite good at it and really do it as much as I work, I guess. I try to, but I got the opportunity to join, to represent my country at the World Masters competition in Amsterdam in April, and outskated all of my personal bests and managed to win the whole competition. So get to use the title World Champion for 2 years. So I'm going to use it a lot.
I would. I mean, not many people have that title. It's a good start. What about though the industry title then? Yep. Talk to me about clinical trials site manager. I feel that's probably an understatement of things.
I like understated. So I think trial site manager because to distinguish what we do from the industry. So we VCTC is a clinical trial site. We're not a CRO, we're not a tech company. We manage patients on clinical trials for our sponsors and our CRO partners. So I really lead the operations in that company. It's co-managed by myself and Dan Henley, who's the other co-founder. And we have seen, so I've spent the last 15 years or so doing operations in clinical trials, so done global trial management, those types of roles, and I've always felt like we could do it better. I've always been disappointed with how long it takes to get trials up and running, how slow recruitment is, how sometimes how much we ask our patients to do on trials, and I just wanted to do it better. So that's what we're trying to do, and actually have shown that we can do. We are specialists in running virtual and decentralised trials, but actually what we do is patient-centric trials. So we run all kinds of clinical trials, both from traditional on-site studies all the way through to fully virtual trials. But in every way, we try to do the best that we can for our patients, and that's what I've always been passionate about. When I started my career, I did a PhD in clinical trial methodology, and I focused on informed consent in research. So right from then, I've tried to take the patient voice into consideration. I've tried to implement that in everything that I've done. Yeah, and that's where we come from and what we're doing now.
Sure. We're going to come back to patient voice, so thank you for it. But let me bring Marie-Claire in. Would you mind perhaps telling our audience a little bit about yourself and the role of Director of Site Success for Site Solutions?
Certainly. So my background is probably slightly different to a lot of people here at Veeva. I joined Veeva 9 months ago now. Before that, I was working as research staff in a number of hospitals around the NHS in the UK. And so really I've been working as a clinical trial radiographer for the last 7 years before Veeva. And similar to Helen, really sort of working to ensure that our patients are cared for when they're coming onto trials. Especially in oncology, we get to see people when they're quite often at the most vulnerable, but we get to give them hope with a trial. It's not always that they get even sort of the arm that might have the novel treatment, but that extra care, that extra support by being in that research sort of environment gives them a lot more attention, a lot more support, a lot more people to talk to that understand what they're going through. And then being able to be there for a patient when they're going through this journey has always been something that's really important to me. During COVID though, I actually started using SiteVault as a research site. and finally got given a system that we could control and we could manage, but actually worked really well for us. And the thing that was amazing to me, this was free. And I just couldn't understand why everybody didn't have this. And we managed to completely transform how we were working. We managed to continue running cancer trials during COVID, which was something that was quite difficult at that time. And it was all because we got to work in a different way from SiteVault. So last year, when the team here at Veeva reached out and they were like, look, we want to really help support the teams across Europe and across the Middle East and Africa, it was just an opportunity I had to jump, because I love looking at how we work in a research team, how we can work differently, how we can work better. And, you know, like Helen said, how we can work smarter and quicker, because it all comes together. And ultimately, you know, if we are making trials faster, if we are making trials quicker, it meets the patients at the end of the day, and it brings more medications to them, and that's what we're all here for at the end of the day. So getting to come into Veeva and now to do this on a bigger scale, and, you know, to be able to work with teams like Helen's, it's just great.
Work smarter and going the extra mile. You use them in different contexts, but could I ask you just to explore a little bit more about that in terms of what does work smarter mean for a site? What are some of the big opportunities that you see? And how does going the extra mile translate from being that frontline physician, nurse, carer into what you're doing today?
Sure, that's a great question, Richard. So I think a really easy example to sort of contextualise, especially, you know, for sponsors and things to understand, working smarter, and especially moving from a paper way into a digital way, could be within our sort of setup process at the beginning. You know, quite often the protocol and the way we're sort of directed of running the trial never really matches the clinical pathway. So you really have to look at how you're going to be travelling this patient through the hospital, and how you're going to make sure that's going to align to the way the protocol stipulates. Now, to do that, you have to get permissions from every different area within the hospital to be able to work differently, to be able to use their facilities differently, and you need to get that permission. Now, traditionally, you'd have to go around every single department with your protocols, with the approvals, with the changes, and they'd all have to review this, sign it separately. That process can take weeks. Now, obviously, these are also very busy people. This is additional workload for them. To be able to do that with SiteVault, we were able to initiate everyone to be able to see this information at the same time. We got all of the approvals back within 2 weeks, and this took 4 weeks off our setup time. And that, you know, that is patients we're able to get, that we're able to recruit to. In some cases, we got drugs to before they either progressed too much or in some cases died. So, you know, 4 weeks for a sponsor is amazing, because, you know, it's the costing. 4 weeks to a patient can be the matter of actually getting a treatment that they could you know, progress or even save their life.
And so for you, going that extra mile is actually seeing a real physical result in a patient's potential life.
Absolutely, always. Or even just the opportunity for them to be in this environment. You know, so many times, even if patients don't get that, you know, the treatment we're trying to investigate, but they get to be in their environment, they get far more calls, they get far more care, they get a whole dedicated team that's looking after them. And obviously, you know, especially from the NHS, we're also busy. Having those teams that really are focusing on them more, it makes them just feel that little bit more supported. And that to me is just, it's why I do research.
It's not bad job satisfaction.
Absolutely, you know.
And actually that's a nice way to come back to the first thing I wrote down, which is perhaps for you, Helen. You said patient voice a couple of times. Yep. Would you mind elaborating on that for me?
Yeah, so before I do, I just wanted to say how much that rings home for me. I've actually had a friend pass away in the last week with glioblastoma, who was waiting to be on a trial, and because the trial wasn't opened in time, couldn't get on it. It really does make a huge difference to patients. And the patient voice in trials, so I'm a rare disease patient myself, so I've taken part in clinical trials. I see firsthand how hard it is to take part in a trial, and I find that having worked in the medical writing side a little bit as well, you can see the disconnect between the design of the trials, the choice in assessments and technology, and then actually what the patient needs in a trial. And the patient, I feel, gets left out of that quite a lot. And as clinical trial professionals, myself included, we always think we know what the patients want. We always think we know what the sites want. But then when you ask them, it's often very, very different. So We use patients in everything that we do, whether we're paid for it or not. We bring in the patient voice. So, for example, we've just recently done user acceptance testing on a study app for a trial, and we brought the patients into that as well. So we're actually able to give them a phone with a beta product on there that they were able to test for us, and it was fantastic. In that particular instance, a lot of the stuff was right, but we were able to confidently roll that out then and say, yes, it works. And yeah, you never underestimate that, the difference that a patient input to a trial can make, in my opinion.
It feels like something we're talking about in different aspects. So as a data manager, we're talking about we need the site's input. And so it feels very natural from a site to say, well, what does the patient need? But all of that then rolls back up. So it's good. It's good to hear that, because one of the things we've talked a lot about, and you and I shared a stage a little while ago, where we talked about what does patient centricity and what does site centricity actually mean. And the risk of assumption is huge. And actually I think this outgoing, assertive desire to collect and gather feedback and do something with it is really, really important. So thank you for all you do on that front. Helen, how about we start with, you opened your own site. You opened your own site pretty close to the beginning of a pandemic. Yeah. I imagine that brought its own challenges, perhaps it brought its own opportunities. But what did it take to open a site, and what was your motivation to do it?
So what did it take to open a site? A lot of hard work and determination and sheer, I guess, competitive drive, which I get from my skating. It kind of all sort of runs in together. I had a lot of support from family and friends as well. It's really difficult opening your own business, but the motivation behind it was always, I want to do better for patients, and I genuinely believe what we're doing is making lives of patients better. So that was the drive. I think my competitiveness is what made me actually get there and do it. But we were offered an opportunity in a previous company to run a decentralised clinical trial in COVID. And it was a situation where you couldn't set the study up in hospitals. There was just no way to run the trial in the UK without doing something a little bit differently. So Dan and I sat at the drawing board working out, how can we run this trial differently? So we ran a sort of a proof of concept, I guess, for the UK in that COVID space. And it worked fantastically. We had a lot of operational challenges. We had a lot of hurdles. We had a lot of issues, as you do when you do something new. But the operational outcome was actually that we recruited very quickly. We kept the patients in the study, and it worked in a space where trials just weren't being set up. They weren't being run. And the one piece that we identified from that is that this is taking place in America all of the time, lots of these types of trials. But in the UK, you need a clinical trial site registered to actually be able to run any clinical trial. Right. You have to have a site. And that was the one thing that we just couldn't find in the UK. We found a way around it, but actually you need a clinical trial site. So we decided that the time was right to fill that gap. And we proceeded without any funding or anything. We just, we managed to make it work. And then, it's paid off for us. So
how has that journey shaped your thoughts on what clinical trials are and perhaps what they should be? Has it significantly changed your perceptions, or do you think a traditional model persists, or how different do you think we should be in the future?
So I think you should always do what's right for the study. So I strongly believe that you shouldn't make anything fit one mould. So what we do at VCTC is we look at protocols and decide what's the best way to run that study. Is it for us to go into the patient's homes, or do we need to bring them on site? Perhaps the drug that's being delivered is more complex, or it has a safety risk. Do we actually need to bring them on site for certain treatments? Do we need to keep them in their NHS clinic and then just draw the data out for those studies? can we do a fully virtual trial? We actually look at what's required for the protocol and then make that fit. So in terms of the future, I want to see more of that. I want to see more of actually how can we best operationalise this protocol, rather than where do we normally go for these types of studies and how do we normally run them? And a lot of that comes back to what's the best for the patient, I think.
That seems to resonate very well with you, Marie-Claire.
Absolutely. Looking at sort of the ways we sort of have always traditionally run studies, and this even sort of working, my experience has always been a hospital. But even then, the confines of, well, you have to have this here, and even sort of where we've had, technologies come in and we've tried to do ePro, the patient will still have to come on site because we have a device, and because we have this one device, they have to come here to fill this out. But it's a tablet. Like, they could fill out a tablet out questionnaire at home. They don't have to drive 30 miles, pay £8 an hour for parking to fill out an electronic questionnaire that I could have emailed them. But it's, again, this is how it's been designed and this is how we have to carry it out. The way Helen and her team are working, that's what we should be doing, and that's going to bring more people into trials, and at the end of the day going to give us much more data that's going to be far more representative of the population that we're trying to treat.
I think I've made my views on the use of the phrase decentralised clinical trials quite clear. And for anyone who doesn't know my views on decentralised, I think it's a terrible phrase. I think it should be removed from our vocabulary once and for all. That does not mean for 1 minute I disagree with the goals, the aims of bringing trials to patients far more effectively and efficiently. But what's your views? And maybe I'll start with Marie-Claire and then we'll calm down. Is it digital? Is it hybrid? Is it decentralized? Does it not matter? Is it a philosophy? Is it a tactic? Is it a strategy? What do you think?
I think it's a great buzzword at the moment. And I think the way that Helen described it, of we should be able to design the trial that's going to be working the best way to be able to include the most people. And then we should be able to give that to people who can look at this and go, how can we collaborate to make this work the best? How can we run this the best way, the safest way, and the most inclusive way? There's sometimes we are restricted to, we have to do XYZ procedure in this way just because that's how we've always done it. And that doesn't work. We can be looking at running trials in pharmacies, and we have teams using Sitebot doing that. And they're having great reaction, bringing the research to people in their local community. So you don't have to travel, even in London, £40, £50 worth of travel fare just to be able to get access to a trial. Now, obviously, in larger countries, that's even bigger. We should be bringing the research to them to be able to allow that to be possible, whether it's a centre, a bus, teams who are working in different ways. And I think, bringing sites to the table and having those partnerships and those conversations early can allow the people who have the ideas and how we can design these studies, and the people who know, actually, these are different ways we could actually recruit to this and come together and bring us all to have a seat at that table.
I think you've touched on something, and I'm going to come to you in a second, Helen, but you've touched on something that's important to me, which is, and this is why I don't like the word decentralised, it's a very black and white thinking. I prefer, and I don't want to just add vocabulary, but I prefer this concept of distributed or digital or whatever, because at the end of the day, surely a clinical trial is a clinical trial. I like your analogy of we'll work out how the best way to do it, but a trial's a trial. And I go back in time when adaptive trials came around, and what's the only thing we saw? Everybody put the word adaptive in every protocol title. It didn't appear anywhere else in the document. Yeah. And I was talking to someone here yesterday who said, the first conversation they have, they're a big CRO representative, and they said, we talk about whether to put DCT into that study proposal or take it out. And I just kind of find that bewildering. Surely the protocol is driving you to that. You can't decide, we'll use DCT, we won't. But I'll get off that particular soapbox for a second. Soapbox. Helen, how about you? What do you think about that same question?
So, you know my opinion as well. I hate the word decentralised. I use it because that's the industry the industry term, but I feel what we do is actually centralise research. So we actually centralise the processes. We do all of the data entry centrally. We do all of the outreach to the patients. We do the training them on the technologies that we're delivering to them. So we're almost centralising those processes, and we've just got approval for the UK's first central PI model in the UK, which is actually using us as a central hub and then NHS clinics to see the patients within their standard of care. So it's a hub and spoke model, but using a commercial hub site. So that's very exciting, that opens it up. But it's that, however you do it, it's centralising all of the processes. If you see a patient in Liverpool in their home and another one in a pop-up clinic down in London, you're still seeing them in a place that meets their needs. But it doesn't have to say decentralising the protocol. It doesn't have to say DCT. It just says you see them as part of the study. And there are times when it's not appropriate. Oncology trials being one, although parts of that can be incorporated into what we do. There are times when you need to see patients in traditional sites, and there are times when you don't. And actually, by doing things slightly differently, you free up the sites to do the studies that they really need to do as well. So that was a very wishy-washy way of saying, I don't like decentralised, but we haven't quite worked out what the right term is yet.
I'm very interested in what does then an average day for you look like, if there is such a thing. So what does a day in the life of your clinic look like? Is there anything you would like to share with the people watching this podcast about things you're striving to achieve, but also perhaps obstacles you would like to clear? And then I'd love to come to you, Marie-Claire, and we'll build from there.
So I guess a day in the life of us is the same as a day in the life of any site. People struggle to get their head around how we work because we say we're a virtual site, but actually we do things exactly the same as any site would. We just do them in a slightly different way. So if I take informed consent as an example, because it's always the one we get asked, how do you manage informed consent in the UK? And we have a call with the patients. We talk about the study, we give them time to answer questions, then we book them another visit, but that visit is a telemedicine visit or a phone call visit where we make sure that they want to take part in the study. We give them the informed consent form to sign, but instead of it being there in person, we're emailing it to them or doing it through a study platform. And then the investigator's signing it, and then we're bringing them into the trial. So it's all exactly the same as you would have in any other trial site. We have a pharmacy, we have IP being dispensed to patients, but then instead of the patient picking it up from the pharmacy, we just send it to their home, either by the nurse delivering it for their visit or via a courier. So same principle. You know, if we've got to watch them taking their medication or train them on that, we still do that, but we do it via a telemedicine visit rather than in person. And again, I'll go back to, we've been doing that for a long time. Telephones have been used to call patients. Whether you call it a telephone visit in a trial or not, sites have been using calls with patients for a long time to follow up. So I guess the answer is our day is not much different to anyone else. We're seeing patients on trials, we're providing them medications, we're looking after their safety with our investigators, and we're using SiteVault to manage our day-to-day sort of administrative tasks on the study in exactly the same way as any other site would.
How does that sound, Marie-Claire, with your experience, both prior to Veeva and now in Veeva? Do you think that, does it sound very familiar, but how does it align or differ from your experiences?
Yeah, so, very similar. Like, my days would quite often be sort of, seeing patients within the clinics, fitting in the admin and the data around that, early mornings, getting sort of like all of your queries done, rushing out to see your patients, running back to print everything out, getting everything ready for the next set of clinics, having patients that pop up at different time frames than you were expecting, but getting phone calls in, organising packages to get shipped out to patients, and so very similar to how I used to work in the hospital. And sort of now, sort of with Veeva and with our site success team, we're a team of ex-research staff, and we're here to support sites who are trying to come. Quite often in Europe, it's that first system, and they're trying to think about, how do I take all of those paper processes and our SOPs that we currently have, and work in sort of like a more sort of digital way. And quite often it's the same processes. You just need to think about, actually, if you don't have to be running around to be able to print things out, if actually you can be in one room and then actually walk across on your other site, you've got all your systems there. You just need to open it up. And so it's just allowing people to think in different ways, and sometimes it helps to have a team to work through those things with you. But, you know, being there for, I'm trying to think about this, how can Siteful allow us to do that? And we work through them with the teams, like with Helen's, and just sort of help them come along on this journey with us. So,
are there any success stories that you've seen, worked on, supported, that you could share that can kind of add to what does good innovation look like? What does a good solution look like that we might share with our audience?
Oh, that's a good question. So success to me is actually when the teams are able just to bring our systems in without them having to massively change how they're working, that it can just fit in and be a part. You know, I use sort of like ePro and eConsent when they first started coming in, and you had all these devices that were provided to you. All of a sudden, as a site, you're quite often, you know, your site office is generally the smallest office in the hospital, and you're already overcrowded with all this paper. And now you have 15 tablets because every sponsor has decided to go digital and give you a tablet. But now you have nowhere to put 15 tablets, and your head of your hospital is like, why do you need to like have all these locks put on your doors? I'm like, well, now I have like £8,000 worth of computer in my room, where previously I had a Windows 95 on the world's oldest computer that nobody would have stolen if you tried to give it away. And working in sort of different ways that allows them not to have to, you know, rebuild the office, re-download software, get a computer upgrade to allow us to be able to work with this another tool, and be able to just actually have one thing that they can incorporate, that they don't have to be, you know, a technical whiz. They don't need to have some sort of IT degree to be able to understand and how to use and how to put it into practice. That to me is success. You know, when teams can come on, we have a conversation, or they just sort of look at our material and be like, hey, yeah, great, I can get on with this. And it can just be a part of my day. But actually can take away a lot of the added stress, the added burden, the added documentation that, you know, while is incredibly important to running a trial, also takes time away from, you know, being able to find more patients, spending time with them. And it's trying to find something that meets us in the middle, that allows us to do our job better and smarter, but also, you know, ensure that we're still getting all of the right level of requirements and safety and documentation, so that when we do get audited, it's easy to do that. But equally, with a system that works well for you, it's a lot easier to prepare for that way than a traditional audit when you're having to pull paper around, pull things from different areas of hospitals, pull things out of like off-site storage. When it's all just there and it's digital, it's far easier to do that. And it takes a lot of stress from the team. And that to me is a big part of success.
Good. You mentioned a couple of things there. Patient-caregiver relationship.
Yeah.
Obviously, different therapies, different conditions.
Absolutely.
But just on average, or just in general, how important is that in that clinical setting in terms of, and I guess what I'm really asking is, can technology actually hinder that relationship and have a negative impact? Or does technology generally help that relationship and help give the patient a better experience?
I think it can do both. You know, obviously, you know, there's so many conversations about, you know, how technology is like negatively impacting everyone's lives, but at the same point, it's also allowing us to connect in new ways. And if the advantage of having technology in your trial means that somebody who physically couldn't get into your site gets to take part, they get to have, you know, the voice in the trial, they get to experience the treatment they wouldn't be able to, then that's a fantastic thing. If it becomes something that is just like another hurdle that's just been put into the place and into the trial just for the sake of having technology, and you're now trying to force people who, you know, the one that always gets me, intricate questionnaires where they're trying to sort of touch a screen and they've got Parkinson's. So their hands are generally not the most dexterous, and you're trying to get them to use a technology that might have like little small buttons. It's not always been thought through. Where we can have systems where you can just, you know, people can use their own devices, the things they're comfortable with. You're not having to take away the phone that they use every day and give them a completely different model that looks different, feels different, they don't really understand how it works. That becomes something scary to people, especially if it's like an oncology trial where our patients are generally older. Now, I'm not saying that they don't have their own technology. I've had 90-year-olds who've been in with an iPad, an iPhone, and they've got everything. But then I'm giving them this weird Android and they're like, I don't get how to use this one. Can't I just use my own phone? That becomes a barrier, because as opposed to being a more inclusive way and an easier way for people to get and provide that information to the trial, it just becomes this sort of gimmick that we've added in, and that just becomes another hurdle for them to jump over.
What do you think patients want from clinical trials?
I think it depends what type of trial you're running. So if we talk about actual sort of patients in trials that are aiming to access it for something that's going to hopefully support whatever they're going to see their doctor for, I think patients want access to new treatments. They want an opportunity to be offered something that they wouldn't get in their standard of care. There's a lot of thought around altruism in clinical trials, and that's why people should take part in clinical trials, and that's a lovely thought, but I think patients want to take part because they get something out of it. Now, in a lot of trials, in oncology, for example, they're getting their potentially new treatment out of it, or they're getting additional MRIs, or they're getting better care, as you spoke about earlier. That's what they're getting out of it. And I think in different trials, there are different things. We are setting up a Parkinson's disease study at the moment, actually, and it's one that we've decided not to do in the virtual setting for the reasons you've mentioned. And we are making that trial like a day out for them. So, you know, we're bringing them along, we're putting them in a nice location, we're giving them a cup of tea and a biscuit, we're giving them someone to talk to, and we are going to hopefully make it a nice experience for them to take part in the trial. So I think patients want different things depending on the types of trials that they're taking part in and their individual motivations as well. And I think everyone is different, and therefore every patient is different.
I want to move into kind of my final question for you, which is where I end every one of our podcasts. But I want to thank you for everything you've said so far, and I think if I can, I'm going to summarise that we've decided it's not decentralised, it's not centralised, it's not distributed, it's not digital. A trial is just a trial. And it feels like we've also concluded there's a big opportunity to really understand what patient centricity is and what site centricity is. And actually learning from both is vital. So I think that seems an obvious conclusion, but I think there's a risk some of us think we've already done those things. And what I'm hearing is, no, we haven't. There's an opportunity to go back and do it properly. All right, let me bring you to my final question then, which is my favourite. I always like to ask people, if I could give you a magic wand and you could change two things, you could make one thing just go away so we never had to do it ever again, and there's one thing you can't do today that suddenly you just would be able to do, what would it be?
So the thing that I would take away is source documentation. So I understand the reasons behind it, but from an outsider's view, the fact that we have to write the information down on paper or electronically or however we collect it as a site, and then we have to transcribe that data directly into the EDC, field for field, and then we have to have a monitor come out to check that we've correctly done that, when in any other field you would just put those data directly into the EDC. That is an awful lot of waste of time, in my opinion, and I hate it. So that would be the thing that I would get rid of. One thing that I would add is the ability to access patient notes in the UK electronically. We have a really great system that allows us to access GP notes for clinical care, and we're not allowed to use it for research. It's what we have to do is we have to write to GPs, we have to ask them to send us the notes, which they do, which is burdening GPs. It's again lengthening the time that we take to recruit patients. It's often meaning that we can't get patients on a trial if we can't get those notes. And that is the one thing that I'd add, is some way of having patients' notes electronically in the UK.
So you would remove notes and add notes?
Remove notes and add notes, perfect. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Marie-Claire, how about you?
Hard to follow up those points from Helen. They're brilliant ones. I think, Helen's point about, removing the extra steps where we seem to just ask sites just to duplicate and triplicate the level of work just for the sake of that's how we've always done it. I think that's it's a great point. I really definitely agree with that, and I think that's that's something that's that would be beneficial in all countries. It's not just something with the UK. Anything I would add on to that is looking at how we could have a better use in technology and how we can collaborate better together, and really just listen to what is needed more from sites and from patients to be able to give us all a seat at the table to collaborate better moving forward.
We could probably talk for a lot longer, but I just want to say thank you, Helen. Thank you, Marie-Claire, for your time. For everyone who is with us listening, I hope you found this as interesting as I did. If you would like to contact either of our two presenters today, please let me know. We'll be delighted to put you in touch. If you found this podcast interesting, I hope you will listen to our previous ones and perhaps join us for future ones as well. And of course, if you would ever like to be a guest, please let us know as well.